This is our second year in this venue, and the second year that we have elected to have a person from the literary field come and talk to us about bipolar disorder, and I'm so glad that we're doing it this way, doing it in the evening, and doing it here at this wonderful auditorium. It's just a wonderful place to meet. I want to welcome everyone who's listening in on the live webcast. We're just live streaming this here this evening, and I think it's also going to be recorded, and so we'll be able to stream it from the web later on. I want to specifically thank our sponsors this evening, the Bruce C. Abrams Foundation and Hallbooks Roofing. And I want to also just to welcome Maria Hornbacher, the author of Madness, A Bipolar Life, and the book is going to be, or is on sale out in the foyer out there. I also want to explain how we're going to take the Q&A. We're going to have 2 3-by-5 cards. One of them is going to be to ask Maria a question, to write down a question for her, and we'll bring them up. I'll be sitting at the table here, and I will receive those cards, and I will then sum up or bring the questions together. Frequently, there are questions that are organized or around a particular theme, so I'll sort of bunch them together and then pass them on to Maria. And the second set, or the second card, will be for the panel discussion that we will have after the presentation from Maria and after the video that we show. We're very pleased to share with you and tell you that we are now named the Heinz C. Prechter Bipolar Research Program. This was designated in May following the generous gift from the World Heritage Foundation Prechter Family Fund. Made a $5 million challenge gift to the university. It will be paid out as a match, and so we're encouraging everyone to join us in the fundraising and the support of the research so that you all know that every donation will be matched. And so we're very, very grateful to the Prechter family and for their dedication to bipolar research and to all of the things that we have been doing. And in introducing Wally Prechter, I want to really just emphasize and share with you that we as a research team, we as a group of investigators would not be where we are today without the dedication, the support, and the enthusiasm of Wally Prechter and her family. The support of the Prechter family has just kept us going throughout the years. It's kept our longitudinal study on track and kept things going in an enthusiastic way. I talked to many of the investigators who really appreciate the work and the support of the Prechter family, but also there's so many people that are participant in the study, and they know that there are individuals out there such as the Prechter family and so many others that are supporting the research, and it really makes everyone feel validated and just supported in a way to know there are wonderful, kind, and generous people that are supporting this cause and supporting this research. So in introducing Wally Prechter, I just wanted to really just say that and thank you again for the support. And Wally, I would like you to come up and say a few words and introduce Maria Hornbacher. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming today to this 11th annual lecture of the Heinz C. Prechter Bipolar Research Program. Every year we have a lecture here, and we feature scientists sometimes who enlighten us with the latest research, or we have individuals who deal with bipolar, or we also have caregivers and patients who are patients themselves. This year we are very fortunate to have Maria Hornbacher with us. At age 24, she was diagnosed with type 1 rapid cycling bipolar, which is the most severe form of bipolar. Maria is an award-winning journalist and a best-selling author. She's described by the New York Times as a virtuoso writer and master storyteller. She's an award-winning essayist and internationally best-selling author of 5 books. Her works have been published in 18 languages, and her writing across genres appear regularly in literary and journalist publications around the world. She teaches in the Graduate Creative Writing Program at Northwestern University in Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you Maria Hornbacher. Thank you.
Good evening. I love saying that. I want to say thank you, first of all, to all of you who came out tonight. I don't know if this happens to any of you, but coming out and about is not always the most obvious thing for someone with bipolar. So if any of you have bipolar and getting out and about today was, sketchy, I want to thank you in particular for coming out tonight. I also want to thank the Prechter Center, Wally, all of you who have made me feel so welcome and who have brought me here tonight to meet these wonderful people. And for the work you do, I cannot thank you enough. In 1999, where's my little doodad? Here we go. There we go. In 1999, when Christie Furness was 26, she walked down the hall of the psychiatric ward at Minneapolis-Hennepin County Medical Center, known nationally for its exceptional trauma care and locally for the nightmare conditions on its psych ward, and stopped at the nursing station to take the fistful of meds handed to her by the harried nurse. She had no diagnosis. She had no idea what pills she was swallowing. In fact, she had absolutely no idea what was going on. What she did have was a question. She waited until the nurse finally looked up and asked her what the problem was. The nurse hesitated when Christie said politely, is this thing going to go away? The nurse, her face turned sweet, kind of kind, the type of expression that communicates, oh, you poor thing. After a long pause, she offered, well, it will get more manageable. Christie nodded, taking this in. So, she said, you mean I'll get used to it? She continued, telling me this later. So when the doctors were like, oh, yay, we know what you have now. You have bipolar. I was like, oh, yay, well, screw that. But a few years back, Christie got married. On her wedding night, as the crowded room of people blew kisses and kazoos, I thought of a comment I've heard from parents more than once whose kids are dealing with bipolar disorder. The worst thing these parents often say is that their child will likely never marry. Why that would be a crisis and why indeed marriage is seen as proof of sanity, I'm not sure. But I can speak to this one myself. Not only can you get married with a mental illness, you can do it as many times as you want. But Christie and her spouse Ruth are the strongest, sanest, steadiest couple I know. On their wedding night, as they danced themselves silly, I suddenly started to laugh, remembering an afternoon many years ago when my old friend Trockman and I were sitting on a couch in the living room, slumped in a heap of sweatpants and pajamas, looking like the loons we always become in the wintertime when the days get dark. We looked out the window, we looked at each other, we looked into the fire. Trock heaved a giant sigh and gave a sort of wistful smile, as if imagining a romance, a beach scene, a crazy dream. He said, wouldn't stability be nice? And in fact, it is. I am Moody. That is my diagnosis. In truth, I have gone through so many diagnoses that I have come to regard them with a certain measure of skepticism, but nowadays my chart is spot on. It states that I am nicotine dependent, that I experience periodic insomnia not otherwise specified, and that I have, quote, mood problems, end quote. In short, I smoke, I drink too much coffee, and no question I am moody as hell. But nowhere in my 10-ton chart will you find my profession, my community affiliations, my meditation cushion, my poems, my ability to make a really good pie crust, my failure to have ever once passed a math class, the fact that I don't have children, the fact that I procrastinate and mope, the fact that I mentor young people, the fact that I have 2 strange little dogs, the fact that I like to go hiking, and perhaps you will say none of those are relevant to my chart, but they are vital to my mental health. They are central to the way I live and perceive who I am. They are the things I have gathered around me to create a life, a future, and a sense of self. At some point in the past few years, I got tired of thinking of myself as ill. It's exhausting. It isn't the core of who I am. It is an element of my experience. It is a fact of my biology. It is a feature, sure, of myself. So is the fact that I'm a professor and a student, a wife and a friend, a daughter and one of those eccentric aunts, someone who does laundry and empties the dishwasher and takes walks and drinks coffee, and incidentally, I have an illness. I have occasional organ failure. Sometimes the squiggly lump of gray matter tucked neatly into my skull shorts out a little, but a lot of the time it works. So it makes no sense to identify myself primarily or always with an illness. I'm not ill right now. When I'm ill, I will deal with being ill. The rest of the time, I am in some dynamic stage of healing. I'm on the complex, lovely, challenging, lifelong journey that I choose to call recovery. I am not an anomaly. I do not have a quirk of DNA that results in my being able to rise above my mental illness. I can no more rise above my mental disorder than I can rise above my height of 5'1". But height does not appreciably change. The mind does. The mind, mine, yours, orderly, disorderly, is not static ever. Consciousness is more than the sum of the gray matter that generates it. Consciousness is, by its very nature, in a constant state of change. The capacity for disorder exists within it, so does the capacity for order. Disorder is hell, and healing is hard, but the mind can change. The healing of our most complex organ is not a well-understood or overnight matter. It requires many things we don't know yet. The things we know, it requires retraining our physical bodies, our psychological structures, and our sense of self. That is a very tall order, but it is the order, and it can be done. My journey isn't special. We walk this path side by side. We know all the twists and all the turns of this road. We know the cliffs and the valleys, the flight and the fall. We know where mental illness can take us, its heavens and its hells. We know the way the road shapeshifts. It seems at first that we're walking on steady, solid ground. Then suddenly it's rocky, and we stumble just a little, but we find a foothold, and we start climbing, and we're sure we're on the way up. And then, without warning, our feet slip and we tumble, and we don't know where we'll land. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, before internet, before cell phones, before the unraveling of DNA, and long before anyone was seriously talking about mental illness in children. It would be years before my family would have any idea what was going on, and before I myself would understand why I thought and felt so differently from other children. I knew something was wrong. We all knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what, and we didn't know why. By the time I was in my early teens, my family and I were caught in a revolving door of therapists' offices, hospitals, and psychiatric institutions, with first one diagnosis and then another thrown at me as I grabbed at anything I could find to try to control the spinning in my head. The mood swings of what we many years later learned was bipolar carried me from elated highs to suffocating lows, from manic weeks awake to weeks laid out flat on the floor of my bedroom with blankets thrown over the windows to block out the incessant light. I went from staring out the window of the psychiatrist's office while he scribbled on his yellow notepad to bouncing around on the cheerleading squad to sobbing on the bathroom floor at school. My parents were frantic. My teachers were baffled. My friends laughed at my incessant jokes and tried not to notice as I grew steadily more gaunt, more scarred up, and more empty-eyed. Gradually, this was the conclusion we all drew. I was one screwed-up kid. I had no better explanation for it myself. I did my best to hide the fact that it was getting worse. My parents did their best to get me help. But by the time I was 20, I'd been hospitalized half a dozen times and done a year-long stint in a locked ward. At 21, in an extreme manic state, I opened my artery to see what would happen. And what happened was that I had a very hard time convincing the attending physician that I was not, in fact, trying to kill myself and did not want to be dead. I just wanted to get off the roller coaster. When this doctor told me I had bipolar, I should have sat up and listened. No such luck. When the doctor said bipolar, I said, no thank you. Who wants to believe that they have an illness from which they're told they'll never recover? Not me. Not anyone I know. It's a horrible feeling being told that you're sick and aren't ever going to get better. You don't realize then that it can be better, that you can heal. I, for one, thought the doctor had handed me a guarantee that I was on my way to being a bag lady, a crazy lady, one of the, quote, mentally ill. So I ignored him. He told me I had to change everything I was doing. I changed nothing. He told me I had to stop drinking like a fish, working myself to death, sleeping not at all. I thought that's what was helping, the only stuff that was helping. And he's telling me to stop? Forget it. So I took his pills when I felt like it, when I remembered. And I kept on living the way I was. I pulled it together again, just like I always had, and it was just like it had always been. The dissonance between what I seemed to be and what I was, between what I wanted so badly for my life and what I actually got, became excruciating. And when I was 27, suicidal, psychotic, my family stepped in and did what I had always been afraid someone would. They got rid of the last vestiges of the normal life I clung to, got rid of my job, my house, my maxed out credit cards, my precious booze, and essentially locked me in my mother's attic where they could keep an eye on me. I went plummeting into a depression so severe I thought I'd never come out, and it was there at that bottom that I did what I finally needed to do. I gave in. I don't for a minute mean I gave up. I mean I gave in. I surrendered. I finally understood that the way out was through. And as I set out on my journey through the confusion, I began to understand that there was hope. I started taking my meds, I stopped drinking, and I started living the way the doctors had always said I would need to if I wanted to survive, and I wanted to survive. I wanted it so badly I could taste it. There's nothing like fear to motivate a person, and I was scared. Gradually, I began to get the hang of this life thing. I began to understand what living meant. Bipolar disorder isn't the sum of its symptoms any more than the people who have it can be summed up by the notes in our charts. Illness is a subjective experience, and the experience can't be captured in diagnostic terms like mania, hypomania, loss of impulse control, and lack of insight. The actual experience of uncontrolled bipolar is one of chaos, struggle, repeated trauma, and loss. But it is not all of those things all of the time. Mental disorders follow an arc of change over time, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. The term disorder itself stands in for a broad spectrum of mental experiences, and mental experiences are never the same thing twice. The language we use for mental illness tries and largely fails to hit a moving target, the malleable, mysterious, constantly shifting human mind. Like every experience, like every disease, bipolar is more a dynamic process than a fixed event, and its course is influenced by a host of factors, too numerous and nebulous to name. The brain is the most complex organ we have, one that's defined and determined not just by chemistry, biology, and genetics, but also by influences of consciousness, memory, language, emotion, behavior, environment, experience, perception, and infinitely more. This is the physical organ that allows us to process information, to learn, to create from nothing, and to conceptualize ourselves and the world around us. While treating my brain will help modulate the symptoms of my brain disorder, my mental health care needs to deal with my mind. The old models of mental illness do not approach questions of who I am, how I live, what I want, what I believe, and who I intend to become. Those questions are absolutely vital for the treatment of my mental health. Mental health is not just the absence of illness. The goals of recovery go way beyond a reduction of symptoms. The concept of recovery, which I know is iffy, complicates experience, moving beyond symptom management and into the complex, layered, diverse, messy experience that is the recovering person's life. We know a lot more about the nature of the disorder than we do about the nature of healing. When the human mind and brain are more fully understood, we may well be able to treat, predict, maybe prevent bipolar disorder. But until we do have that ability, we need to be taking a close look at recovery in order to better understand it too, and to raise its prevalence among people who are struggling now. Recovery takes a while, and it requires a lot. It's not just a matter of meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Certainly, when those needs are met, the ability to recover is exponentially greater. The social and economic barriers that block our ability to meet our own basic needs creates a crisis in psychiatry and society that does not and will not budge until social policy and public health have substantially changed. I am sharply aware that recovery itself is a resource that requires access and means. There are pieces of my recovery that would not be obtainable if I could not meet my basic needs. While this is not technically the topic, I can't disregard the fundamental importance of economic resources and effective medical care to recovery. Recovery begins with acknowledgement. I have to acknowledge that I have a mental health disorder, that management and eventually improvement are entirely dependent upon my willingness to stay alert, active, and aware. Now is not the time for me to decide I don't feel like having a mental illness or waffle about whether I'm going to take my meds. I need to acknowledge both the power and the potential of what I'm dealing with. I need to know both what I'm up against and what tools I possess. Recovery requires awareness. We need to learn exhaustively about our disorder, the available treatments, the risks of staying untreated, the resources that exist, and the resources we can be for our providers and our peers. When we begin to educate ourselves, the hard facts can be frightening. It can seem, when we begin to read and learn and talk about our illnesses, that things are even worse than we thought. The statistics aren't encouraging, but we are not statistics. We can choose how we beat the odds. We may still struggle, we probably will. We may still have episodes, it's quite likely, but we don't have to live in chaos, and we don't have to die of our disease. Recovery requires us to act. We have to get help, and we have to be an active part in determining our course of treatment and our care plan. We need to develop strong support systems for ourselves and investigate recovery strategies that go way beyond the traditional. If all I do is toss back my meds and usually show up for appointments, I have not actually looked very hard at myself or my life. Where can I do more? What can I do that I haven't tried yet? What am I doing that's holding me back? What can I change? Where can I make a choice? It may seem contradictory, but just as much as we need action, we need acceptance. We need to recognize that some aspects of illness are stubborn, some will not change, some will never go away, and some will. We can accept this illness for what it is now, today, not regret what it was in the past or wish it would be something else in the future. With acceptance comes peace, and with peace comes power. Recovery requires great expectations. For all their variety, recovering people share an approach to their mental health that does not accept management or functionality as a final goal. We cannot accept those as the upper limits of our lives. Functionality and management are the beginning. They are the baseline, the starting point as we set out into the lives we want to lead. Recovery requires community. I had an alarming interview with a major figure in scientific research earlier this year. He is a brilliant scientist, a good doctor, and a really nice guy, but his honest, upfront opinion is that there aren't very many positive outcomes in people with mental illness. When I asked him what accounted for those positive outcomes, few as they may be, he said, "I'm not sure, but I don't think it's a bunch of people sitting around talking to each other." His remarks showed both bias and sharp lack of awareness of the fact that recovery happens and the fact that it is, in fact, spurred along by sitting in groups talking, whatever those groups may be. Community of all kinds, not just the community of other people with mental health problems, encourages a person to integrate his or her experience into a broader context of experience. In that way, community helps us develop an identity beyond illness. It gives us a new perspective. We are able to see ourselves not as broken, isolated individuals, but as members of a group bound by multiple strengths and connections as part of a larger whole. The development of our community can only lead to better research, better treatment, better policy, and better lives. And recovery requires advocacy. I don't mean writing letters and lobbying to influence legislation, though I certainly feel those are necessary tasks. What I'm talking about here is what Justin hates, the skill of advocacy for ourselves. As vital as it is that I be diagnosed and medically treated, it is equally and probably more important that I know how to identify and reach my own treatment goals. Not so I can be said to have succeeded at treatment as an end in itself, but so I can succeed in my life. Psychiatric care has historically been somewhat disempowering, and only with a sense of empowerment am I able to act as my own advocate in treatment. That, in turn, is the only way I will be able to bring any energy to my work, to my community, or to social advocacy on a larger scale. There is nothing more clear at this critical moment in our understanding of mental health than that we do not know the half of what is possible. We do not know what discoveries are coming. We don't know what the new treatments will look like. We don't know the specifics of how our work, our lives, and our society will change. While we have imaging technology that could show you the language and memory centers of my brain lighting up if I was manic, we do not have the technology sophisticated enough to tell you why, after 30 years with a lit-up brain, I haven't had serious mood swings for years. My doctor can't tell you why one combination of meds works for my body and not for that of someone with the same diagnostic code. He can't tell you why the unbelievably large doses of meds I once needed to keep myself healthy are toxic to me now. The amount we don't know about mental illness is breathtaking. But we know how to treat it more effectively than we currently do. Dr. Steve Hyman, former director of the NIMH and current director of the Stanley Institute for Brain Research, calls this, quote, the unconscionable gap between what we know and what we do. The assumption that is often made about people with mental illness is that we can't speak for ourselves or advocate on our own behalf, or that we simply won't. Too often it seems this is a belief that we have come to share. Our voice has never in history been clearly heard. That isn't because we don't have one. It is not because we are incapable of making a case for our capabilities, our skills, and our basic rights. If we support one another and act as a group, not as individuals still locked in the isolation chamber that stigma and shame create, we can create change. There are people who will work with us. We need to find them. But first, we need to find our own strength. How many of you doubt sometimes that you're strong? How many of you hesitate to say you have a disorder of the mind or love someone who does? How many of you hide it? I do. I still do. I doubt my strength every day. There are days I get tired. There are days when, for reasons clinical or situational, I do not feel like getting out of bed and going back to work and going back to the work of getting stronger and getting better and taking my stupid meds and doing my stupid yoga and calling in a therapist and using my voice all over again. As you know, this sometimes feels like heavy lifting. There are days when I do not feel a great big surge of positive attitude and major strength on my own behalf or anyone else's at all. I've been known to spend a day or two in bed. It's been a while, but I've been known to spend a month or two in bed or on the psych ward back in bed because this is sometimes hard. And I think I spent 1998 making moccasins and getting electroshock because sometimes this is hard. But I still need to step up. I do not see millions of people untouched by mental illness lining up to change the world on our behalf. I do not see a powerful lobby of our members on Capitol Hill. I see those in the caring professions, many of them here tonight, physicians, psychologists, nurses, researchers, workers of all kinds, working day and night to change our lives. I see our families and friends working to support us nonstop and heal themselves as well. I see a few brave souls beginning the necessary work of fighting the political and social stigma that wreaks havoc on our culture and on us in real daily ways. The fight against stigma today is the fight of modern scientific and experiential knowledge against the force of antiquated, nearly superstitious beliefs about mental illness. The trouble is this: the progress of the science and medicine of the brain is still held back by the powerful cultural misperceptions that remain uncontested by fact. Science is, and always has been, inflected and shaped by cultural beliefs. It takes society time to shed its faith in old science before we catch up to the new. We no longer put leeches on people when they're ill. But the conviction that we ought to was, at one time, pretty strong. And let's not get into that whole flat earth thing. More to the point, societies have always borrowed the language of science to justify social controls for which there was no ethical excuse. The power of stigma has been alive and well for centuries, and it has always been used toward the erosion of someone's rights. And that is how stigma works. The perpetuation of stigma depends upon the perception that it is founded in fact. For years, the sharply limited scientific understanding of the brain left ample room for guesswork in the public mind about what mental illness is. And that guesswork has led to a spectacularly thorough misperception of mental disorders, the people who have them, and what they mean. We are not so far distant from the dark ages of the science of the mind. But as with the Age of Enlightenment, the rapid transformation of science in the present day could well transform our lives. At the core of our social failure to see the potential of people with mental illness is an assumption that the potential doesn't exist. The premise that supports stigma, the inaccuracy that is held as an article of faith by many Americans, is that mental illness is a hopeless, devastating condition that prevents its sufferers from any kind of productive life. I would venture to suggest that is perhaps not the case. But I have listened to an astonishing number of people, both those who know nothing about mental illness and those who supposedly do, tell me that there is, for me, no hope. I think there is. My life and the lives of millions of people who live and cope effectively with mental illness are evidence that bipolar is by no means a death sentence. We are the evidence that mental illness is a feature of mind, a feature of human experience, not the definition of the human, not the sum of his life or herself. There is a persistent belief in our country that some are deserving of health care, social resources, and basic rights, while some have not earned them and never will. The sociological faith that healing and change simply are not possible for us writes us off in a way no other stereotype does. We are treated in many ways as an expendable population, a waste of social resources, unproductive and therefore undeserving of care. And this notion is based on the flawed premise, the premise that people cannot change. And so, if we can't change, if we can't heal, what's the point in continuing to work toward the improvement of our lives, our health, the organs in our heads? If we can't ever be productive members of society, why should society expend the effort and the cost? One reason that comes to mind, we are currently quite expensive, and we don't have to be. The fiscal burden of untreated mental illness is catastrophically high, to say nothing of the cost to our lives and the lives of those we love. Stigma is nothing if not short-sighted, and stigma, not illness, is the primary cause of this social cost. Stigma creates a lack of care. As care deteriorates and our access to it dissolves, the actual impact and incidence of mental illness rises, as does the cost to our lives, and so does the cost our illness creates in turn. In many parts of the country, social services are being slashed, psychiatric professionals are dealing with caseloads in the thousands, emergency rooms are glutted with uninsured patients, and psych wards are becoming a revolving door of people in crisis who don't have any continuity of care. Low-cost clinics and care centers are diminished and closed down. Research money that funded development of new medications and treatments is pulled, and new treatments are abandoned or never researched, cutting off future access to practical recovery options that are entirely, I believe, within reach. The more we don't treat mental illness, the more intractable it becomes for the individual, and the more we individuals become a social issue that society needs to solve. Would we say that people with other treatable disabilities or illnesses, like ours, simply require sufficient and effective health care, should be allowed to live subsistence lives and die 25 years younger than the average American? Do we assume that we have nothing to offer? Why are we failing to tap the resources of such a huge population? It makes very little economic sense. There are no other illnesses approached in this way. If there were, I wonder how people with that illness would respond. I have to think they would do something. I have to think they would make a change, and we need to do just that. I have a friend who works in marketing. One of his favorite lines is, "Hope is not a strategy. We can have hope, we should have hope, but what's the strategy we need now?" We need science. The breakdown of stigma can come in part from the rapid expansions of knowledge in this field. Research funding for the practical application of new brain science is still ridiculously scarce. Federal funding for the study of other brain disorders is many times greater than the funding for the treatment of mental illnesses. Bipolar has been a known phenomenon since 1876, and anti-bipolar medication hasn't been developed yet. I don't get the sense that there is a major social push for one, so we have to be the social push. We need a sea change in psychiatric care. The medical and therapeutic fields upon which we have historically depended are now in the throes of major change. We need to be a vocal part of that change, first and foremost as the guiding forces in our own treatment, as collaborators in our own care plans, and also as activists toward greater accessibility and quality of care. There is more to life with mental illness than management. Management is a piece, but we can do better than that. And we need ourselves. We need the strength of our numbers, because not only can we survive these illnesses, we can thrive and we can drive the necessary change. Of the millions of people whose lives are touched by mental illness, we are the lucky ones. We may not always feel lucky, but those of us in this room tonight have a community. This is it. We have access to some kind of support, some kind of resources, some kind of treatment, some kind of care. And if we have these things, then we have resources that millions of people do not. An enormous number of people slip through the cracks because there are countless cracks. How do those people survive? They don't always. And if they do, they often do so in a pitched battle for their lives. Whether or not we know them, whether or not we think they are our responsibility, we need to shoulder that burden, along with whatever burden we carry of our own. Is it a lot? Yeah. But those of us who have the resources, who do have community, and who do have awareness, must make that choice. We are the ones who must change the world. It isn't always a friendly place to people with mental illness, but we have the capacity to make the change. I think we've lived with limitations long enough. We can make the world a future place where we can cultivate mental health. The journey of healing doesn't begin later or set out from some later point. The journey begins where we are. The healing starts here. Thank you.
So all of you will have the cards. Remember I talked about having 2 cards. And so our staff will be going around picking up the cards and bringing them down. And so we have approximately 15 minutes now for a Q&A with Myra. And so in my privilege as being the moderator here, I can ask the first question.
Whatever you want.
Thank you again for such an illuminating talk. One of the things that you brought out was the challenge in giving up things that you felt helped, and you referred to the alcohol and a variety of different things. Now, one of the things that we are faced with here in Ann Arbor and many places is obviously the substance abuse issue, but specifically medical marijuana. And so we had a debate just this past week in our research team about the concept of medical marijuana. And the researchers said, well, should we code medical marijuana under medication because people are identifying it as, this just helps me, I have a couple of hits before, and that, or is it substance abuse? And so I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on that.
That's a really good question. I think there's such a division on medical marijuana, not just on legalization, but on how should it be used with mental health. And among the people I talk to, and I talk to lots of people who have mental health problems and deal with them in various ways, some people argue absolutely, I can't sleep without my medical marijuana. My anxiety is too high without my medical marijuana. And I am certainly not in a position to say, well, stop smoking your medical marijuana. That's not my position. My position is that if I smoke medical marijuana, I'm not coming out of my house again for a week because I'll still be smoking the medical marijuana. And I'm one of those people who's genuinely an addict, like an alcoholic. And I think some people are probably suited to use medical marijuana safely. The fact that better than 50% of people with bipolar are predisposed to substance abuse, not just misuse, but abuse and addiction. The predisposition that we have toward addiction is so high that I feel it's a really risky category for potential medication strategies. On the other hand, benzos are prescribed freely, equally addictive, and that you didn't ask that question. I'm not going to try and answer it. But yeah, that's where I'd go with that. I think some people could, but the 50 to 60% of us who suffer from addictive trends probably shouldn't touch it.
Yeah, it's my sense that there's a difference in the way that individuals with bipolar disorder abuse substances. I've heard people tell me, for example, when I'm manic, boy, can I go? And then one person said to me, no, I'm just so depressed I don't even feel like using. Has that been your experience? Or
yes.
And so it's variable. It's up and down. It's like the illness itself.
It's like the illness itself. There are a lot of people who identify as binge drinkers who have bipolar, who go long periods of time just drinking a little or not drinking at all, and then in an episode of up or down will go through a mad binge of drinking or using drugs. And I believe in those instances, it is a matter of the goal-driven behaviors that you see. They may also be shopping. They may also be driving 120 miles. I may also be driving 120 miles an hour. I haven't done that in a while, but fact is, those surges of energy that we were talking about today manifest in all sorts. It's like playing whack-a-mole, where you're
something comes up.
Which is the thing that happened that day, which is the symptom.
Yeah. So there's one comment here that touches on suicide, and the comment is, our biggest fear is that our 18-year-old daughter, in the depths of despair, when she cycles down, will commit suicide. She's expressed suicidal ideation in the past, and I wish I knew what question to ask to help reduce that risk, the question to ask now or the question for the daughter. How can we reduce the risk to prevent her from harming herself, from committing suicide?
From a clinical side, that and I speak as someone who has been suicidal, who has attempted suicide. So, it's not like I'm coming in from this abstract point of view. So not from the clinical side. From a gut level, really keep an eye on alcohol and drugs, because the vulnerability to impulse at times of use is very, very high. When drugs and alcohol are involved, suicidality can go way up. And so as a parent, you're always navigating that. Where do we draw the line with our kids and substances? Navigate it very carefully, in this particular case. Sleep is essential at that age in particular, making sure the body is cared for. Sleep, food, staying out of anxiety-producing situations, staying off of social media. Those are all things that experientially I know help in terms of what escalates or drops my mood. Those things always. But in terms of how do we keep our daughter here with us today? The thing I have always told people is, this is what my mother said when I was about that age and thought, probably asked someone the same question. She said, we just hold her loosely, but we never stop holding. You keep her held within a certain circumference of safety. And however your family defines that is how you define it. You keep an eye on that more carefully than, maybe your neighbors do on their kid. But your kid, has that vulnerability. And so you hold her, but you hold her a little bit loosely so that she can grow and develop, and so that she can grow past those dark times.
Thank you. A couple of questions regarding ECT. Firstly, your perspective on ECT, your thoughts on ECT, and then after reading your book, I was amazed that you remembered your journey through the ECT. Has ECT impaired your memories?
It has not now. My memory, I haven't had ECT. Let me back up. Answer the first question yet. There are, 3 primary modes of treatment. There's the electrical treatments, there's the pharmacological treatments, and there's the psychosocial treatments. So electrical is a perfectly valid treatment, and it works for a lot of people. It worked very well for me to break me out of a very severe catatonic depression, and those are hard to break. It's really hard to get a person, hop up and say, take a walk. Well, I'm staring at the wall right now. I've been staring at the wall for the last 9 weeks. But what I found absolutely critical about electroshock was recognizing that the memory alteration would be temporary. I have not permanently lost memory. The memory that you have immediately after electroshock is like, who are these people and why are they in my hospital room? But or where did I put my cell phone, and then you find it in the refrigerator. Your short-term memory is zapped entirely. But the long-term impact of electroshock, in my experience, has not been to diminish my memory capacities. It would be very devastating if it had been long-term. My husband, on the other hand, has epilepsy, and his memory is very seriously damaged. Different mechanism, different kind of brain seizure.
So there are a number of questions here that relate to your personal management plan. Mm-hmm. How liberating is it to be completely transparent? And so, and just an envy of the fact that you survived this all and that you're still here. And then, despite all the difficulties that you have, there was one question: have you ever been convicted of a DUI? Even with all the
yes.
all the difficulties that you've had. And another one here regarding your personal symptoms regarding disassociation, described as a hiccup, and so just sensing a tremendous admiration for your abilities to survive and get through this.
We're really durable, guys. I mean, the body, for one thing, is incredibly stubborn. Really wants to stay alive. The brain really wants to stay alive. And so if you kind of err on the side of just go with it, your body does a lot to take care of you. Your brain every now and then sort of derails, but you can manage that. My friend Christie, who was the first quote we saw, who said, I'll get used to it. She taught me once, she said, I was saying, what do you do? She deals with positive symptoms like audio hallucinations when she's manic. So I said, what do you do when that's happening? And she said, well, I just have healthy Christie take care of sick Christie. And healthy Christie says, sick Christie, you're talking to yourself in a coffee shop. Time to go home. And we go home. And I'm like, does that ever give you a sense of dissociativeness or whatever? And she said, no, it's insight. You have to have that moment of insight. And, I know one of our symptoms can be lack of insight. but it is not a continuous state. You are not always lacking insight. There are moments where, my insight is not great. I bought a $3,000 picnic table once, and that was not insightful. That was not strategically planned. But the other days where I'm like, okay, the anxiety is escalating. Why? What's to be done about it? How can I respond? How do I escalate this back down? That moment where you realize you have influence over your moods, thoughts, and responses, that is the critical moment in recovery, I think, when you realize you can turn the volume up and down.
Now, the other role, number of comments and questions regarding psychotherapy, and then the relationship between the causation of symptoms with regards to the family and the details of family interactions. So speak to us about the family, about psychotherapy, and sort of social treatments.
I think they're really, really vital, especially at this time when we don't yet have super great physiological interventions. I think therapy is vital. To me, therapy is vital, and I have a lot of people in the medical and psychological helping fields who will back me on that. To me, it is vital. And it is vital not because I need to go back and work on issues about my mom that happened when I was 4. I'm 43. That's not the key issue right now. The key issue is, why do I still identify myself as a failure? So we work on that, because you're all going, what? Well, I do. So we work on that. And every one of us, I think, would benefit from having someone to bounce ideas with. What I work on is life skills. What are the perceptions I still carry that are holding me back from being useful, from being productive, from being helpful, from being open, from being kind? What are the things that are holding me back? I think a lot of people would do well in therapy. I do. But for me, it is essential because when I don't go, I still lack enough coping skills that I can get into real trouble if I don't have someone going, hey, how about that coping skill? You have it, you're not using it. And so that guidance is really helpful to me. Family therapy, I think, is essential for families who have a loved one with bipolar, simply because there's two sides there. My parents will say, you destroyed our lives and we're bipolar and you were always almost dying. And I'll say, you destroyed my life because you never understood anything. Families are a mess. Anyone from a functional family? Because, I love my parents profoundly and they love me and we drive each other crazy. Families need help. Families, especially at this time when we're all staring at our phones at dinner, need some help communicating. And you need help communicating about something that has such silence around it. So I cannot recommend family therapy highly enough either.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So again, there's a number of comments here that really speak to your ability to communicate with everyone. I could really relate to your experience. Thank you for writing, sharing, and advocating for us. So a comment from the audience. And so one person asks, they ask, how many diagnoses did you have before you got the bipolar diagnosis? Another person is asking, how can you be certain that you have a diagnosis like bipolar disorder? And another one asks here, now what level do you worry and what level do you not worry? And so there's clearly a lot of
good series of questions.
Series of questions, yeah.
I will answer those in order. My first diagnosis, I think this happens this is pretty common. People with bipolar often manifest with addictions first. And so my first diagnosis was ragingly anorexic. And they're like, oh no, she's not eating. And when they got that squared away, they were, oh no, now she's using lots of drugs. And then we got that squared away. And then I was really nutty for a while. And they're like, there may be another issue here. So my third diagnosis, and I was well into my 20s, I was married and I was profoundly extra supermanic. And the doctor said, why haven't you ever been told you're bipolar? And I'm going, what's that? And this is back in early 90s. And so they had just really transitioned out of manic depressive to bipolar. And not everybody's happy about that. But I really had no idea what it meant. And I said, am I going to get any better? And they do the poor you thing, and well, you'll get more manageable. But it turned out there are more options. Periodically, I have run into the diagnosis invariably from a psychiatrist I have run into the diagnosis of borderline, but it's never stuck, and it's only ever come through because I have a history of cutting while manic. The problem is I've never cut when not manic, and so it's not a consistent symptom, and I haven't cut. It was a very brief stint. And so, how do I know I have bipolar? Well, my moods, you can track them, like, you can set your clock by them. I still have them. But the major mood swings where I lose insight, those are the ones that have been gone for some time. I'm, like I said, super moody. And that's just a matter of day to day, really kind of micromanaging the energy levels and the choices and the inputs that I give myself. I mean, frankly, if I'm on Facebook too long, I'm manic, and then I can't sleep. And then trying to explain that to someone who doesn't have bipolar, I was on Facebook, now I'm manic. What? Well, I just am. So you guys get it.
Yeah. One final question I think that is really in line with our discussion, and it's a very simple question, and I love it. How do you control your impulse to spend when manic?
I cut all my credit cards up years ago. Oh, I have no credit cards. No, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, very practical solution. I cut up all my credit cards. I have a debit card. They charge you more at hotels when you have a debit card. It's hard to buy things that you don't have the money for, and I do not have credit cards. Haven't for 10 years. And I am not in debt. It's neat.
Oh, wonderful.
The $3,000 picnic table I can't account for.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your... Now, it is my distinct pleasure to play for you the video that was made this past several months, and many of you here were interviewed for this video. So I've been instructed, I just need to push this arrow and it will play.
I've been exhibiting symptoms of bipolar since I was 6.
My parents always thought that I was very moody.
Rational thinking doesn't come into play.
The two parts of my brain don't line up.
Like, I have an outlier brain.
People can't relate to it. I mean, I lose friends and burn them out. I mean, they can't keep up with it.
I can't work
Like a tornado coming through. There's no filters.
Manic a lot of the time. Depressed even more.
I promise things.
It was constantly.
I guess like megalomania.
Your mind's just really uncomfortable with me and with bipolar.
I wasn't present.
Eventually I wanted to die. I just become someone unrecognizable to myself or to my family that couldn't get it under control.
We are enthusiastic because we feel and we're convinced that we're on a winning streak. We're on a winning streak from every dimension. We're understanding the physiology of the disorder, we're understanding the biology of the disorder.
What we're really trying to do is simulate in a tissue culture dish what a person might be feeling or how they might be reacting in a situation.
When neurons fire, their signals are much stronger for bipolar individuals than healthy controls.
And you can see that reactivity in the lab. So when the cells fire, they fire with a greater intensity from individuals with bipolar disorder.
You'll see that as a flash of light. They're more active, they're more reactive to chemicals than cells that come from control individuals.
Reactions that might seem like overreactions, they can't help because their neurons are firing so strongly.
What sets this program apart, what makes it one of the great guiding lights, is the sheer energy that drives it. This translates to a program with more ideas, insights, and nuance in a field that depends on exactly.
University of Michigan, broadest bipolar research.
At the center of it all is one of psychology's most ambitious studies to date.
There's nothing else like it. There's no other study in the country. Thousands of individuals.
The amount of data that we've collected over these past 10-some years
Is growing exponentially.
The longitudinal study 10 years now. Every study that branches off of it.
What the longitudinal study has given us is this vast warehouse of knowledge.
The longitudinal study is kind of like the glue to the programming.
It's part of my making this identity something
not just one gene or two genes that contribute to the illness. There are many genes. Gene of substantial interest is called anchorin 3, which Dr. Paul Jenkins is studying here in our group.
So there are many neurons in the cortex, and these neurons are necessary for higher order cognitive function. And these neurons normally would fire just by themselves. So there are interneurons within this mix, and they synapse on to all of these cortical interneurons, and they act to synchronize their activity. And so this synchronization is necessary for normal cognitive function. This is lost or altered in patients with bipolar disorders. And so now these neurons begin to fire randomly, and you lose normal function. So what we're trying to do is find ways to restore these synapses by using small molecules so that these can be resynchronized.
Just made great progress so far.
We are changing things, the way we look at mental health, the way we look at the brain.
I believe that we are on the cusp of major new developments and discoveries.
We're also interested in capacity to predict.
I do believe that priori be life-saving.
You can track mood using cell phone
To
conversations.
predict when someone is developing manic episodes or developing depressive episodes just by using mobile technology.
It will give clinicians the opportunity to monitor the well-being of their patients.
So that they can see for something desperate.
To do that, we really need to collaborate with mathematicians, with computer science modelers.
Molecular and cellular biology, cardiology.
It's not one person working in a lab.
There's a lot of collaboration between different departments here.
The depression center understands the complexity of bipolar disorder, the complexity of depression.
The program has synonymous with bipolar disorder.
What happens in the cells of someone with bipolar? Can be attached to mutation. What is the role of stress? Genetics. What can we provide?
I think what's going to shake out in the long term is we're going to find different categories of bipolar and to categorize the various kinds of bipolar disorder. We'll more rapidly be able to predict what medicines the individuals might respond to.
Forward.
That is tremendous change.
New knowledge, new understanding, and new ways to intervene, new ways to predict outcomes, and new ways to help individuals fulfill their lives.
These researchers, they all really care. They can get to the bottom of this maze. There are millions of people around the world.
There we go. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for sharing this evening with us and looking at and watching this video. I thought it was great, and I just want to compliment the people at the University of Michigan that have put this together. We have a really wonderful team that does the video. Jeff, he's a very creative guy. We love working with him, and he just simply does a great job. So I'm going to ask the panel members to come up now and to take a seat here. And I'm going to remind you again of the Q&A cards. There are a couple of cards I think that I left there that I can probably begin our discussion with. But in summary of our progress in the prechter program, we are at around 1,265 in the longitudinal study. These are individuals that are engaged with us on a regular basis. Every 2 months, they're sending in information about how they are doing. As was pointed out, several individuals participate in ever so many different studies. We have on a regular basis, some people obviously drop out, so we have around 970 individuals that are actively participating in the study, and that is about a 75% retention rate, which is over a 10-year project, which is absolutely amazing. And so the three flagship projects are firstly the longitudinal study, from whence many studies derive. We have another program, you saw many of the cells ongoing here, the stem cell project, and then the priori project. So the impact that we are going to make is to be able to identify strategies to predict when individuals are going to get ill and when to anticipate illnesses. And then we want to focus also on identifying the mechanism, the driving force behind the disease process. And so we do that in the laboratory. We do that looking at social mechanisms that cause the disorder, and so in a variety of ways. But now that everyone has been seated here, I'm going to ask the panel members just to go and introduce themselves. And so, Maria, you can just say your name one more time.
I'm Maria Hornbacher.
Thank you. And Dr. Graydon.
I'm John Graydon. I'm the founder and executive director of the Depression Center.
That's the back.
I'm Emily Maurer Provost. I'm an assistant professor in computer science.
My name is Todd Heron. I'm a PhD scientist, and I'm director of the Frankel Cardiovascular Center Cardiovascular Regeneration Laboratory.
And I'm Jennifer. I'm one of the research participants, and this little fuzzy white thing to my left is Maya. She's the therapy dog that comes with me to all the participation things.
Thank you very much. And so everyone has some cards, and we'll be bringing them up momentarily. There was a couple of questions that were left over from Maria, and one was with regards to the family history. Is bipolar disorder, would it be, is it a genetic disorder, Maria? Is it in your family?
Yes. There are a number of undiagnosed folks in my family, but also we have stories going back to my great-grandfather who would run away to the circus periodically.
That's some good advice to take the mics out.
The circus periodically. Thanks. So yes, it does run in families, no question. I mean, it's you can speak much more to the numbers of that, but in my family, it's run very, very strongly in my father's side of the family.
It is arguably one of the strongest familial genetic disorders in all of healthcare. And if one has an identical twin who has bipolar, odds are 70-80% that the other might, things like that.
So there's a question here on video games, and so I'll just perhaps ask Emily from computer science, because we always associate computer games with computer science. For a young adult in particular, can excessive video game playing be a symptom of bipolar disorder? So bring on the microphone. And that. So for everyone just to chime in. So bring your microphones out, hold your microphones out.
Is the question, is it a symptom, Melvin? Or
is it a sign of bipolar?
I think so. What I know very, very limited amounts about video gaming, but I do know that it falls into the category of rapid information in the eyeballs. And optogenetics is enough, I know enough about optogenetics to say that the information we're taking in visually is going to change the way the brain is responding. I find it very, very difficult to get offline, and this just experientially. If I am online, I can't stop. I find it very, very difficult to pull away, and when I pull away, my anxiety just drops. So that's something I know.
Jennifer, do you want to maybe address that as well?
Video games specifically?
Yeah.
My parents made it a rule, my dad can attest to this, made it a rule in our family when we were little that video games were not allowed in our house. I'm sure it had nothing to do with bipolar specifically, but I was never allowed to play video games. Neither were my siblings. So therefore, I never got addicted to them. But I know I have an addictive personality as well. And so I'm sure that if I did, I would get addicted to them. But I've stayed away from substances, I've stayed away from drugs, I've stayed away from everything because I know I have an addictive personality.
One quick comment. I don't know that it's a symptom, but I do know that there are emerging data that are now coming out over and over for both bipolar and for those with depression, adolescents aren't having a good time if they're spending all the time on video correspondence, on social media. And those who do have higher incidences of anxiety and sleep disturbances and other problems. I don't think it's therapeutic.
Yeah, and I want to just to move it over to both to Todd and Emily about, because you guys interact with students quite a lot, and so very often we see or hear of, students interacting or using video games. Do you find that video gaming or gaming overall is a common thing in the undergraduate campus, and is it a distraction for students there, or?
So yeah, I think that video games are a distraction. And for someone that has an addictive personality or a propensity to be addicted to something, video games can really come into someone's life and become an obsession. I've seen it sometimes with my own children. They get so involved in a video game that they almost get disconnected from reality. So I think video games can be just like a substance, a drug or alcohol.
Yeah. So, there's a question here for you, Jennifer. How do pets help in managing mental illness?
Well, I would not be sane without my pets. I have Maya, and I have 2 cats as well. Maya has been coming with me to do the research since 2012, but she's been actually going with me into the community as a therapy dog, as my personal therapy dog, for only about the last 6 months. And that was because my doctor said the difference between her with me and me not having her with me was night and day. That I am almost completely normal when she is with me. Having a dog or a cat changes your life. I'm not married. That's a choice. But to have someone that depends on you and that can support you, she understands me better than most people do. And she loves me unconditionally. People think that she's anxious when she's not really anxious. She's cueing on me. She goes to church with me every Sunday. And one of the things she does is she helps me talk to people. I'm anxious about talking to people, and she knows who's safe and who's not. So she will walk up to people and make it so that I can talk to them. As a consequence, now I know every single person in my neighborhood. I have a 5-mile walk, a 3-mile walk, and a 2-mile walk. I know every house, every person, and that's because of her. I would have stayed in my shell, not wanting to talk to anybody. But because of her, as you can see, I'm pretty anxious. But because of her, I can get out of my shell and I can talk to people. So pets do change lives. So I can't speak highly enough about what they do. They can help anybody. But they do seem to help people with anxiety and bipolar disorder a tremendous amount. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Any other comments on pets from the panel?
Other than the fact that I had to hold Mara back from going over it.
Thank you. So there's a question here that is really direct to Emily. In addition to voice and speech, what else could be worthy of being tracked using mobile technology?
So that's a great question. So one of the things that's so exciting about the fact that most of us now carry phones with us is that we have this unbelievable resource to collect data about what someone's daily life looks like. And when you start to know what a person's daily life looks like, then you begin to understand what deviations mean. What does it mean if someone is using a specific app? What does it mean if someone's using Apple Pay too much? What does it mean if someone's not moving? What does it mean if they're visiting houses they don't normally visit? All of these are signs or symptoms that we can remotely monitor using cell phones. And so it's not just the acoustics of speech. It's also what you're saying. But it's not just what you're saying. It's who you're saying it to. It's where you are when you're saying it. It's about what kinds of social interactions you're being exposed to. It's about your circadian rhythm, which you can also measure from the phone. It's about understanding if you're in noisy environments with other people. Are you by yourself? All of these things are things you can learn through mobile sensing.
Any other comments from panel members on that?
They will be our biomarker tools in 5 years.
To follow up on that, that's the other thing that's so very exciting about mobile sensing, because since you have these tools that are measuring the specific patterns of individuals, then we can begin to identify maybe early warning signs or biomarkers that are specific to specific people, which will help us to deal with such a heterogeneous illness.
Question here about bipolar disorder in children. Are we able to diagnose bipolar disorder in children? And Maria, you...
73.
Microphone there.
I think the understanding of bipolar in children has transformed very substantially and gone through a number of trends in the 90s and early 2000s in particular. So I think I've heard from people that no, you can't diagnose bipolar in children. My mother will say, you better believe she had bipolar as a child. And I think any parent here who's dealt with early onset kids will say, don't even question it. You know, I mean, when you have a kid who's 4 and manic, they're irritable, they're agitated, they're planning ballets and operas and cars, and then they're sobbing in their bedroom. So, I mean, bipolar looks a little like something else when you're little, but it is still bipolar. The diagnosis of it, I think people are more cautious than they used to be. The one thing I will tell you is that in the book I'm working on right now, I've been tracking one young man who's 12 now. I've been tracking him since he was 7, and watching the course of his bipolar in this very key developmental stage, and he is becoming both more insightful and more able to identify his symptoms as he goes. So early identification, I think, is going to be vital, and so childhood diagnosis, therefore, also vital.
I wasn't diagnosed, but I've had bipolar, no question, since I was about 6 years old. And I have the letter my mom wrote to my pediatrician, what's wrong with my child, with the symptoms laid out. I actually got a copy from the pediatrician when he retired. And it clearly lays out mania, depression, mixed episode, all of that stuff. And that was in the 70s and 80s. So even though you may not be able to diagnose it, the symptoms are there. The evidence is there.
I'm hesitant to overdo this, but Maria and I had breakfast this morning, and I told her the story about how Denny Cantwell, an eminent child psychiatrist from years ago, used to say, if you've got somebody who is carrying a diagnosis, entering into adolescent years, for example, of ADHD, conduct disorder, and has a family member with bipolar, think bipolar. And we have had a propensity to give other labels because I think this one scares people sometimes, and yet the earlier that you find and intervene in these issues, the more effective they are.
Thank you. So a question here for Todd. And the promise of stem cell research, can you speak directly to that? What are we hoping to achieve through stem cells?
So through stem cell research, so as you saw in the video, now it's possible to create embryonic-like stem cells for any patient. And what we're doing in my laboratory for bipolar patients is to recreate their heart in a dish. And one thing that I'm hopeful for is that it might help with better and more educated medication prescription. So not every person responds the same way to every medication. One patient might respond to a certain medication by having a cardiac arrhythmia, and another patient may have no arrhythmia. And at the moment, there's no way really to tell unless we can recreate a patient's heart in a dish, which is what we do, And then we can test different medications to see if a patient is very sensitive and their heart may be very sensitive to a medication or may not be. And likewise, for generation of neurons, as you saw in the video, what we found with Melvin and Sue in that study is that patients with bipolar disorder, their neurons fire much more strongly and much more powerfully. So it gives us a target in a dish to try to repair, to try to understand, and hopefully to lead to better treatments.
Great. No, I think that it's been very exciting working with you, and I think that exemplifies the University of Michigan in a major way, the way that and the opportunities that we have to work across departments in the medical school and across schools in the university. And so we found some individuals in our study that have some abnormalities in the way that their heart beats. And at least in the dish, they're fine in the clinic, but at least at the cellular model. And so the question has to be asked: well, what can the heart teach us about how the brain works? And so that is an interesting, fundamental question that's highly innovative and really, I think, speaks to the collaborative that we have here. So a question for Jennifer and Maria. Do you ever miss the euphoria of a manic episode?
There's a correct answer to this and an incorrect answer to this, but the truth is I still have euphoria. I don't have unconscious euphoria. I don't have dangerous euphoria. I experience euphoria the way someone else experiences euphoria, as an emotion, not as a clinical state. And so I'm not missing that extreme joy, the rush that you get from going down a roller coaster or shopping or whatever it is that you're doing. I still experience euphoria, but it's in like really weird times, like at appropriate moments. I was really euphoric at my wedding. I was euphoric at my mom's wedding. It's very interesting to me how those random emotions that used to just kind of ping about in me now match themselves to appropriate circumstances. And so euphoria, I have it when it's appropriate and not when I'm at a funeral. And it's my brain is in line psychologically and physiologically with mood states that match their circumstance. So I don't feel emotionally limited by missing mania. I feel safer. That's the primary difference.
Well, for me, I'm a rapid cycler. So, and I also have mixed episodes. So I could never count on true emotions, and I never had pure euphoria like you're talking about. So, no, I don't really miss it. But yet, I've been stable for the most part since 2004. I have little blips where I'm not as stable as I would like to be, but they're not severe. I haven't had a severe episode, but the last severe episode took me 2 years to get out of. But I don't miss the euphoria. I don't miss the depression. I don't miss all of that stuff. I like being consistent. I like things matching. I like knowing that my brain lines up with who I really am. The other thing, I haven't been asked to talk about this, but the medications make me more myself as opposed to less myself. And that's one thing that a lot of bipolars don't realize, that if you stay consistent with your meds, you will be more who you're meant to be than who you're not meant to be. And that the euphoria that you think you're going to miss, the reality will take over. And that's what actually you will want, and that's what you will crave.
Thank you. So there are a number of questions that relate to the actual diagnosis of bipolar disorder. How is a definitive diagnosis made? Is it purely on the basis of observation, or are there tests? And what about an individual who had a clear diagnosis of bipolar disorder but is no longer having episodes of bipolar disorder? And what about the relationship to other illnesses? Are there relationships with, for example, gastrointestinal disorders or other diseases. And so what is bipolar disorder? How are we diagnosing it? Are there any tests? And where does it fit in the world, if you will?
Tough question. I wish we had those tests that Dr. McInnes is referencing. We don't yet. But I think that's, again, the miraculous stuff that's almost underway, including even some of what you're hearing here today. I don't know, by the way, just a sidebar, I don't know whether all of you appreciate the kind of innovative, groundbreaking stuff that's being described when people talk about the pluripotent stem cell work and about priori and some of the other things. These are scattered in several places in the country, and this is one of them, and it's probably been a leading one. So that's the sidebar. The diagnostic aspects, I don't think, are good enough yet. We desperately need bipolar biomarkers. We need tests that could be done that would be genetic sampling, cheek swabs, doing things that would enable us to say, this is the medication that one is most likely to respond to. That's some of what's being worked on. Lacking those, I think there is still too much, let's try this. Oh, that didn't work, let's try this. It was said earlier by several of the people, but just, I love it, and we talked about it at breakfast. This is a concept, and every opportunity I get, I think all of you ought to incorporate it into the language. We don't have depression, we have depressions. We don't have bipolar illness, we have bipolar illnesses. They are heterogeneous and they have multiple causes. It's our challenge now of how do we find which of those causes responds to which intervention. And that's actually what everybody now refers to as precision health. And it's underway. It's a big, big deal. We need to work on it, and that's actually why when we talk about things like matching dollars, that's the kind of stuff that it will get used for. So unfortunately, we don't have all of the resources yet from NIH or others.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, one of the amazing things about the university, kind of more broadly. There's such a push and recognition of the importance of cross-disciplinary research. There's so many research questions that are larger than one discipline. And one of the amazing things about the research that goes on here is you have this opportunity to say, okay, you have part of the puzzle on this side, we have part of the puzzle on this side. How can we come together and bring knowledge that doesn't exist anywhere? And so part of the reason why we're so excited to have, as computer scientists, this ongoing collaboration is that we get to say, okay, so we can measure parts of daily life. We can provide summaries for what people's day looks like. And now we can understand what those summaries are actually contributing to. Maybe they provide a better way of showing efficacy of medicine or the onset of symptoms, or they provide diagnostic aids. These are the types of things that these collaborations can provide.
Melvin, if I may, just one more thing. Todd is doing really creative work, and you then couple that with what's being done in the prechter bipolar program. One of the things that all of us should probably recognize is we're not broken up into brain and heart and knees and elbows and that kind of stuff. We're all together. And Todd and I were sitting down below talking about this. The reality is that some of the same dynamics that are being looked at, for example, if we get cardiac tissue, cardiac cells growing in a dish, and there are neurons growing in a dish, we're going to find perhaps that the same inflammatory processes, the same interleukins, the same cytokines are operating in our body at large. And the data hint at that now. If someone has depression or bipolar illnesses, the odds are considerably greater that they also have cardiac disease, and vice versa. Inflammation down here, this isn't exempt up here. And so I think what we're really talking about is how do we use the knowledge that's coming from different segments of our academic world and put them together, and that's what Emily just said very nicely right now.
So I think that it's also worth commenting on, we had a wonderful person from MIT come to actually study how researchers interact. And she was from the Department of Anthropology at MIT. And so she went around to 3 or 4 universities and spent 4 months in our lab. And it was really enlightening just to see her interacting with folks, to sort of looking at and measuring how computer scientists and psychiatrists and molecular biologists and cell and developmental biologists are interacting. And so we found ourselves on a number of occasions sort of taking a few steps back and saying, could you actually just clarify what you meant? And so that was a very interesting and novel experience. I'd never had that kind of a thing before. Now, so there are a number of other questions here that I want to bring out. And one was relating to creativity. And so as a creative person and an actor, I want so badly to hope that I'll do my best work when I'm feeling well or more stable. Yet there's a lot of connection between creativity and madness. And can I really hope to do my best work when stable? Or will I lose my creative energy when I'm stable? In other words, do you have to be a little bit hypomanic to be creative?
That's a great question. I think the process of training the brain to behave the way you want it to, when you want it to, is a long process. Learning to write again after having been deeply destabilized with mania and depression was a process. And so now, the things that I tell my students, it holds very true for us. When Nabokov was asked once, do you write only when inspired? And he said, yes, and I'm inspired every morning at exactly 8 a.m. That's what you do. You sit down and you wait for it, and if it's not there that day, you keep waiting until it's there. And you can really retrain yourself. It's not that your creativity is tied to the madness states. Creativity, bipolar, addictiveness cluster in families and genetically line up. Don't know why, nobody knows why yet, but creativity is there, whether you're manic or depressed or not. The creativity genes are there. And so you need to learn how to tap that in a way that is non-destructive, in a way that is productive. I mean, I have, when I wrote my second or third book, I wrote about 3,000 pages. I was very, very manic. Ever seen a 3,000-page book? Long book. Nobody wants to buy that. Costs like $900. And then when I threw it out and got onto my meds again, I wrote the book in 9 months by working from 4 to 9 every morning. I worked for 5 hours every morning, and then I went to my job, and it was done in 9 months. And I wasn't manic, and I wasn't depressed, and I was at my most stable. I was also not hypomanic. The ideas don't necessarily come zing, zing. It's not you don't necessarily have that all-nighter excitement of but I'm also not going to parties and taking ecstasy anymore either. Life moves on from the exciting days, and you get to be really, really productive only when you're stable.
Right. I had a postdoc working for me many, many years ago, and she said there was the worst thing that would come out in a lot of these publications was that the assumption is when you're manic, oh, you have bipolar disorder, you're very creative. She says, no, when I'm well, that's when I can be creative in my academic work. So the point was along those lines. Exactly, you need to be well. Jennifer, you got a microphone?
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I'm a singer, and I'm also a writer. And I found that when I got stable, yes, it took me a little bit longer to figure out, just like you said, it took me a little bit longer to figure out how to be more disciplined, but it actually became easier for me to be creative. It became easier for me to follow the regimen. It became easier for me to actually do the things that needed to be done. When I was in college, I went to U of M here to study music. I could never practice. I never had the discipline to go into a choir or a practice room to put in an hour to do the vocalises that I needed to do. I couldn't do it. Now I can. But that was the bipolar keeping me from doing what I needed to do. I don't write like I used to, but that's partly my choice. It's not as much of a passion as it is, but I still do love to write, and I tend to write more about what living with bipolar is on Facebook for my friends and family. And I've actually helped a lot of people understand what living with this is that way. So that's my outlet for writing. But the music, which is my creative outlet, it became so much easier.
When you're well. Yeah, no, absolutely. And speaking of wellness, there are a number of questions here, about 5 or 6 cards that really address questions related to medication, to interventions, everything ranging from ECT to fish oil to, whether an individual with bipolar disorder who's been well for a period of time, up to 10 years, should we still treat them and consider them bipolar? And sort of a very broad, I just want to have a big broad range of discussion points here around all modalities of treatment. And Mari, when we were talking today, you shared with me that you've been around talking to so many people and so many scientists and clinicians. And so I feel you've got a really interesting perspective on the treatment modalities that are out there and the perspectives that people are sharing with you on what works, what's new, where are we going, and that. So you want to lead the discussion on that. Thank you.
I will. I'm excited to. I'm working on a book about mental health recovery and how what do we mean by it, and how does it happen, if it happens, and where is it going in the future as this science moves along. The people I've talked about 1,700 people who live with mental health disorders of a variety of diagnoses. And what they say is the meds are okay. You need them. Meds are baseline. Got to have them. But they hit one button. There are like 47 buttons that you need to hit for wellness. And meds are a really important one. But that's not the key of people's wellness, is what I'm hearing people say. And some people, say, I do know that without sleep, I'll be crazy very quickly. I know without exercise, I'll be blue. If I don't have, I'm at the age where now if I don't have my hormones, I'm awful. And, various and sundry other pieces. What we need to do is start changing, I think, our looking for the magic bullet is got to stop. The one pill that's going to do the thing. It's not how humans work. It's not how bodies work. It's not how the disorder is organically. It's not organically single factorial. It's multifactorial. And so the treatments that people talk about are creative life, are going to work, are volunteering. I talk a lot about vocation and avocation. Doesn't matter if you're paid. Getting paid is great. But the point is having that functionality in your life where you can give back a thing rather than constantly sense that you are not having anything to give. So that's partly psychological, but it's also partly practical. You structure your days around your work. So things like that are what people say, my work keeps me well, my family keeps me well, my church keeps me well, and for a lot of people it's not God saved me, it's I go to church from 7 to 9 every day, and that's what's working. A lot of the pieces are much more straightforward than you might think, and medication is just one of a whole host of options that we all have.
Yeah. John, you want to?
I think that's beautifully said, and I'll just add on in just the respect that if we could learn from cardiologists. I've always been very perplexed by those of us in whatever field you call us, psychiatry, behavioral health, medicine, brain, mental health. When you look at the cardiologist, somebody goes in and they have an acute coronary, and they're put on a beta blocker, and they're on lisinopril, and they're on their aspirin, and those are all different kinds of medications. Simultaneously, they're being told, you need to exercise, you need to stop so much alcohol, do something about the conflicts with your spouse, there's too much stress, your sleep pattern is ridiculous. They work on all of it. And they work on all of it because the data are so powerful that these things are all variables. And we have just as much powerful data that is showing us that family life and where are you with your recreation and your exercise and your walking and all of this. They are so vital and so important. And we don't recommend it. We get into our little pockets. We have psychopharmacologists and we have mindfulness therapists and we have psychotherapists who do CBT, and it drives me crazy. So next time any of you are out there and you go see somebody, say, treat all of me.
So I just wanted to comment on the long-term medication. So going back to the stem cell project, so one really beautiful aspect of the pluripotent stem cells and to be able to recreate a patient's neurons or heart muscle in a dish is that we can start to apply medications long-term to those substrates in a dish and then understand the consequences of long-term medication because we don't really know what the long-term effects are of any medication. Some medications for bipolar patients are taken for decades, constantly. And until the advent of stem cell research, we never really had an avenue to study the physiological effects of those long-term medications on multiple organs within the body.
I think that is just so exciting to be able to do that. And it's just like when somebody develops a pneumonia or bronchitis, what does the doctor do? They go and they take a sample or they take a swab. They grow it, the bugs, if you will, the pneumonia that's causing the pneumonia, in the presence of the various different antibiotics to determine which one is going to be the most effective for one's illness. And so if we have a model like this to be able to determine which medication is going to be most effective, that would be simply wonderful and amazing. So a question here for you, Emily. Patterns of speech on tone that indicate suicidal modes. So there's a general question here. Can you identify suicidal moods? Moods from the tone of speech or patterns of speech or that. So how can we predict suicidality?
That's a really interesting question. So for a long time, we in engineering have assumed that there's this beautiful, perfect mapping between whatever data we get and whatever labels are assigned to that data. That's the premise of machine learning. And I remember, as an aside, when we first started working together, I think I spent about 6 months to a year regularly asking Melvin for labels. I was like, Melvin, I need the labels. Is this person manic? Are they depressed? Do they have bipolar disorder? Are they healthy control? And it was over time that I began to realize that one of the great complexities of these types of problems is that this very notion of what a label is and that a label exists is not correct. And so one of the reasons why this is a very challenging research area is that we have to work with that level of ambiguity. It's not necessarily, especially in the case of suicidality actually, it's not necessarily true that at any one moment we'll be able to perfectly predict the future. And partially it's because people are very complex and measuring behavior is a very difficult thing to do. But it's also because in the case of suicidality, it gets very driven by environmental stimuli. And so perhaps someone experienced something that led them to feel a certain way. Well, if you're not measuring that, it's something that's very hard to predict. And so the way we see our technology interfacing with all of this is providing yet another stream of information that could allow people to have more control over their wellness, that might allow clinicians to just realize that somebody's at an elevated risk, that might allow family members to keep a loose hold on their loved ones. It's not the one, it won't be the one solution, but it will be yet another tool that we can use.
Thank you. And we have a very exciting collaborative project with Brown University to ask that question. Can you use this technology to predict suicidality? So it really is anchored in a research program. So that's extremely exciting. So there's an interesting question here from an individual who says, I have bipolar 2 disorder and I live in the North Bay area of California. My psychiatrist believes I have trauma in my body from my childhood. He relies more on body work than medication for my wellness, releasing trauma from my body. I'm doing well with this method. What does the panel think? And by the way, he went to the University of Michigan Medical School. It doesn't say how long he lives in California.
I want to jump on this one really quickly, briefly. As a person with bipolar and a woo-woo therapist, this is not to say your doctor is woo-woo. That is one of the things that I hear about a lot, and I have not found a lot of data on the holding of trauma in the body. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying as a primary line of attack on symptomology, he may be feeling his way toward it and having great success, and that's fabulous. I was born in Walnut Creek in 1970, whatever, and there's a lot of doctors there who think a little bit differently. It's a little bit different in the North Bay than it is in the Midwest, for example. And so I think if I told my doctor, I'm holding trauma in my body, what I need is massage, which to me seems quite rational, he might be like, what you need is another 17 meds. So part of what we need to do as clients is say, these are things I know. These are things I know are true about my body, my work. These are things that work for me. I know these things will be helpful, and not take only what the doctor orders.
Whoa. I think I get a little concerned anytime I hear anybody come from an area where a comment is made, oh, this is what your cause is, and if we just do this, everything will be fine, when there are often no data to substantiate that. And this particular stuff now, there is all kinds of emerging work that's being done, and the data are extensive about trauma being a very bad variable when it happens during childhood. Those who have sexual abuse are more vulnerable to suicide if this is happening as a child. Where is it? Our brains are always being shaped, so it's not good. But I don't know of a single technique that says I'm going to do the following and all of the trauma is going to exude from my body. And so if somebody could show me, I would love to hear it. It would be
to
something.
California.
Yeah. But I'm not holding my breath for that one. And I want to make one comment just about the wonderful answer that you gave when people asked, Melvin asked you the question, but what about discontinuing medications? I've been doing very well for a while. Those data, by the way, are really requiring long-term data. You have to have, why is it that cancer has talked 5-year survival and now has moved on to 10-year survival? And we still talk 8-week studies and that kind of stuff. We don't have those data, so often they're scarce. What we do know is that whether it's bipolar, depression, or whatever, if people are doing well and they discontinue and you make comparisons even to placebo, I stay on my med, you go off. Going off medications is dangerous if people have been doing well. So the favorite quote is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If people are doing well, keep doing what you're doing.
I remember a very particular comment by Ellen Frank from Pittsburgh. It said, the dose that gets you well keeps you well, and so it was her advocacy to stay on that dose. Somebody have another comment on the road? There's a question here about, in light of your call to arms, Maria, and advocacy for change. And so the comment is that the research piece is very exciting and fabulous and everything, but we really need to identify a strategy to shift the resources or identify resources for mental health. And that this cannot be accomplished by an equal push to impact policy and legislation. And so I'm interested to know, Maria, with what you've learned about advocacy.
I've learned a lot about advocacy. I think I hold with the theory that personal stories compel other people to tell personal stories. And I believe that there, again, is strength in numbers, and that the more of us who are willing to speak of our own experience, not only our experience with illness, but our experience with methodologies of becoming stronger, the more we'll have a say in our care, and the more we'll have a say in our futures. The fact of the matter is we have one lobby, NAMI, and they are amazing and they do beautiful work, but we do not have a political body. We do not yet comprise a focus or an interest group. There's lots of reasons for that. We can think about those. I think that the individual thing to think about is, why am I not yet active? Why am I not yet part of a growing interest group that can represent people who are not at this time in a position to represent themselves, perhaps? There's something called the Stability Network, which is a group of professionals. I'm in it. Lots of interesting folks are in it. People with mental health disorders, diagnoses, who are professional. Look it up, stabilitynetwork.com. And those are people who are getting together to strategize, how does work help us stay well? And so the research that's not happening at very many institutional levels is what works besides the medical. Beyond the medical, what can we do? And I think as an interest group, what we need to be thinking about is how do we get our voices out there, not just to say we're sick, but to say we deserve better care, we deserve comprehensive care, and we can do very, very well if we have those things. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. I'm interested in the perspective of both Emily and Todd as early career investigators or mid-career investigators, in the sense of the policies for funding and what your impressions have been at a policy level for towards our institution, the university, because that is a really important element of advocacy to get more money for the university.
Yeah, so again, one of the great things about being at the University of Michigan, there's not just the, is it? No, I turned it off. Yes. So one of the great things about being at the university is that it's not just the university saying they support, cross-disciplinary research and research into health, it's that they're institutionally supporting it. So there have been all of these amazing funding opportunities supported internally, either through the Depression Center or more broadly through the university, that has actually required having teams of faculty, teams of researchers that are not just in one area. And again, the only way we're going to ever tackle these large problems is if we're willing to talk across boundaries. That's where the interesting research problems are. It's where the novel solutions lie. Outside the university, there's also been a lot of initiatives in supporting cross-disciplinary research. So NIH had funding opportunities that specifically asked for computational partners, which was great for us. NSF now has a partnership with NIH that is specifically looking at how, it's called Smart and Connected Health, looking at how you can have solutions that will cross boundaries. And one of the evaluation criteria is that the PIs don't just staple a proposal together and say they're working. It's that they actually have demonstrated track records of really doing this cross-disciplinary work. That said, one of the challenges always in any kind of new area is that these large funding agencies might not want to support it. And they might not want to support it because they're, reasonably risk averse. And so one of the great things about working with folks at the Depression Center is that there's this amazing support for new promising technology that is much, much too early to try somewhere else. And so we've been on the receiving end of this, being able to ask these questions about how speech might associate with mood, asking about how we can develop new ways of thinking about how emotion perception relates to mood. And so it really is at so many different levels, through donor support, through institutional support, through federal support, that we're going to have to tackle these questions.
Yeah, I have to agree with Emily. So some of my happiest days when I'm at work is when I come to the Depression Center. Ironically.
We have that special effect.
and that's because, as Emily said, there's a lot of risk involved with doing pluripotent stem cell research. And the big funders like the NIH, when I've submitted grants, there's a lot of criticism as to the use of pluripotent stem cells because they're not a heart, right? They're something that we create in a dish. So programs like the Prechter Fund, in my experience with the Depression Center, has been very uplifting in that Melvin and John, they seem to be very tolerable of risk. They seem to be very open to trying new avenues of research, trying new ways to study mechanisms of disease. And it's very refreshing to me, coming from cardiology, where it's very staunch and they don't want to change anything. It's nice to come to a place where ideas are welcome and new ways of looking at things are very, very welcome.
Thank you. So we have one final question that I want to bring out here, and that is, it relates to the longitudinal study. It says, describe how the longitudinal study works, and along the lines of that. So I want to ask you, Jennifer, to lead on that, since you have A lot of experience with the longitudinal study.
This is year 10 for me
Wow.
in the longitudinal study. 10 years. The longitudinal study, I get a packet. Well, it used to be a packet in the mail. Now it comes in my email every 2 months. And I don't remember how many questionnaires there that change depending on what is sent every month. But I think it's, average of 7? Something like that. I think it's an average of 7, and then a couple times a year they're closer to 10. And they have the depression scale, the mania scale, the anxiety scale, oftentimes how you sleep, your general health, basic questions, and a lot of information that they're trying to gather to follow up on what our daily lives are like. And it has helped me in a lot of ways because even though, like I said, I've been stable since 2004, what I have seen, and I've mentioned this once before, even though I may be stable, I'm always a little bit manic or I'm a little bit depressed. Oftentimes I'm exhibiting, because I have mixed episodes, I'm exhibiting the same symptoms of both at the same time. So it's helped kind of guide me and helped shape some of the care that I've gotten, helped taper some of my medications and things like that, and dosages and things like that, so that I know what needs to be adjusted. So there's a practical application for me as well as just giving back. But it's been eye-opening. In addition to the forms that I fill out every 2 months, we come in once a year and do an interview, and then depending on the year, sometimes we can do it over the phone. But we've done cognitive testing multiple years. Apparently a lot of participants really loathe that. I think that's fun. And I like the games. I like a lot of that stuff. I've always enjoyed that kind of stuff. So it's not taxing for me. I actually really enjoy it. That's what I know about.
It's a tremendous commitment on behalf of the folks. And so on the first initial assessment, it can take up to a day or a day and a half. Very comprehensive evaluation. And as you mentioned, we're moving it towards a more electronic capture of data, and so we have a number of questionnaires that are on a tablet, and so you can fill them out like that, and that captures a lot of information, and we avoid the need to input the data into a database. And then I think that the longitudinal study, the importance of it is gathering information on individuals, as a core, and following them over time. And then there are satellite projects that are ongoing, including Priori, the cell phone project, including the stem cell project, but also including a number of other projects, including things like the microbiome project, looking at what the flora are in the gut to see if there are differences in individuals with bipolar disorder. I think that we tallied up around 21 projects that had been ongoing in the past couple of years. And a number of these projects arise because people come to us and say, I've got this really interesting idea. I want to see learn how people move differently in different states. And so we have individuals in depressed states, individuals in revved up states. And so one person, Gu, are you in the audience here? He did his PhD thesis, and he invited a number of individuals to come to the lab to measure their movements, and finds that the way that an individual moves is different according to their mood state. So it's really exciting, and all of this data actually then comes back to the central prechter database, and so someone else downstream doesn't have to redo that experiment because that data has been collected, and so it becomes part of the data corpus, and that is really the exciting part about it. And so it's growing and growing and growing and continues to grow, and so much now that one of the challenges that we have is relates to the data and the management of the data, so that in the future we are anticipating and hope that a student who comes to the University of Michigan wakes up one morning and says, I got this really cool idea and I need to get a data set to analyze it, so they can go into the prechter database and they can set up their criteria, run the analysis, and get their result in a very short period of time. And so that individual would have access to the data that Emily's generating, to the access to the data that all of our collective researchers are generating. And that singularly is amongst the many things, but I think that is one of the most exciting parts of the longitudinal study. So in closing, I just want to say thank you again for coming. You've been a wonderful audience. Really appreciate you coming. We're going to have a reception here in the atrium and a book signing here with Maria. I want to say a special thank you to Crazy Wisdom Bookstore, who have been very helpful over the years. They've come to our events here and helped us with the books and selling the books and sponsoring that table. Thank you to Liz Guzzo, such a wonderful collaborator. Liz has a table there with her jewelry. 50% of her profits go to the Prechter Fund in memory of her son Michael that died of the disorder in 2009. Big thank you to NAMI Washington, who are great friends of ours and wonderful advocates in every way. We love them. We love working with them. We think that they are the most phenomenal community-based advocacy committee ever. I want a special thanks to Kat Bergman, who's the marketing manager, our research coordinator and program manager, Holly Bertram, and of course Lisa Fabian, who is now leading our development program, and she is the person who talks to anybody who's interested in aligning with our program. Some people want to say, I'm really interested in helping out, and we direct them to Lisa. So, and a big thank you to the folks on the panel. It was a wonderful evening, and so enjoyed everything here. So, thank you. And so now we'll enjoy the reception out in the hallway.
In the heart. So the cells that we make, they have a rhythm to them, and we can measure that rhythm by measuring the calcium.